Trump's new press secretary just shattered Ilhan Omar and the entire Democratic establishment. You won't believe what happened live on air. The moment was electric. The press room, packed to the brim, buzzed with quiet whispers and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Anticipation mixed with something sharper, something almost hostile. The reporters sat poised, notebooks open, recorders rolling, eyes locked on the podium as they braced for what was to come. Then, she stepped forward. Karoline Leavitt, Trump's newly appointed press secretary, moved with purpose. Her presence commanded attention. Every step, every movement, was measured, deliberate, controlled. She adjusted the microphone, eyes scanning the sea of journalists before her. She could already tell how this was going to go. This wasn't just a press briefing. This was a battleground. A high-stakes chess match where the media held their pre-planned narratives like loaded weapons, ready to fire at a moment's notice. And yet she smiled. A polite, almost welcoming smile. But beneath it, there was steel. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady, unwavering. "I know you've all been waiting for this, so let's not waste any time." A slight pause. A calculated beat of silence. Then her tone shifted, sharp, controlled, precise. "Before we begin, let's set something straight," she continued, eyes locking onto the front row. "If the media is going to create the rules of outrage, then they should, at the very least, be consistent about it." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. A few reporters shifted in their seats, sensing exactly where this was going. Some stole quick glances at their notes, trying to anticipate her next move. Karoline leaned in slightly, placing both hands firmly on the podium. If a Republican stood here today and said, "We need to fight in the streets," you'd be in full meltdown mode. You'd be calling for resignations, demanding congressional investigations, maybe even pushing for arrests. But when Ilhan Omar says it, suddenly, it's just a passionate plea for justice. The tension in the air became thick, almost suffocating. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke up. The reporters had come prepared to attack her, to trap her in their narrative. But Karoline? She had just flipped the script. Then the first challenge came. A hand shot up. Peter from CNN. Predictable. Clearing his throat, he leaned forward, voice carefully measured but dripping with skepticism. "Karoline, are you suggesting that Ilhan Omar's comments were meant to incite violence?" A flicker of amusement crossed Karoline's face. She tilted her head slightly, as if Peter had just asked if the sky was blue. "I'm not suggesting anything, Peter," she replied smoothly. "I'm quoting her. Or, do you deny that she said it?" The room held its breath. Peter hesitated just for a second. And the cameras? They caught everything. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his lips parted as if to respond, only to press together again when he realized he had no good answer. Karoline seized the moment. "Let's be crystal clear," she continued, pressing forward. "When Democrats call for fighting in the streets, it's brushed off as harmless rhetoric. But when a Republican so much as breathes the wrong way, suddenly it's a threat to democracy? So tell me, Peter, what's the rule here? Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like the rules only apply to one side." Silence. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it again. No response. Another reporter, this time a woman from NBC, jumped in, hoping to change the angle. "Surely, you're not suggesting that the president is above criticism," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Ilhan Omar was simply expressing concerns about this administration's policies. Karoline turned to her, unimpressed. "Oh, is that so? Funny. Because every conservative who's ever dared to question the Biden administration has been labeled a domestic extremist for doing the exact same thing." The air in the room grew even heavier. A few furrowed brows, pens scratching against notepads as reporters scrambled for a counter. But Karoline wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She glanced toward the cameras, her expression sharp, deliberate. "Let's play a little game," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "Imagine if President Trump stood here today and said, 'We need to take this fight to the streets.' What do you think would happen?" Nobody answered. But the silence? That was enough. Karoline let it stretch out, just long enough to make them squirm. Then, she answered for them. There'd be full-blown hysteria. Front-page headlines screaming about insurrection, emergency broadcasts, calls for impeachment. The media would be in full crisis mode. But Ilhan Omar says it? And what do we get? Nothing. Just another Tuesday. More silence. The shift in the room was undeniable. The press had walked in expecting to control the conversation. But now? They were the ones on the defensive. Then, as if on cue, a phone buzzed in the front row. A reporter glanced down, eyes widening before looking back up. Karoline noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked casually. The reporter hesitated. "Ilhan Omar just tweeted about you." A slow, knowing smile spread across Karoline's face. Of course she did. She reached for the iPad on the podium, fingers gliding across the screen as she pulled up the tweet. Then, in a calm, deliberate voice, she read it aloud. Karoline Leavitt is spreading dangerous rhetoric to distract from Trump's reckless agenda. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room. That's cute. A few nervous chuckles. A few reporters glanced at one another, unsure of how to proceed. Karoline continued. But here's the thing, her words? They're on video. Plain as day. And she doesn't get to decide what's dangerous and what's not. Silence. A heavy, loaded silence. The press knew she had a point. They just didn't know how to admit it. Karoline took a slow, measured breath, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Then, with a sharp, unwavering gaze, she straightened up. Next question. The room was still. The tension? Palpable. The reporters had come in prepared to control the narrative. But now? Now, they were struggling to regain their footing. Karoline tapped her fingers lightly against the podium, waiting. She knew they would try to shift the conversation, try to regain some kind of control. And just like that, the next round had begun. Karoline Leavitt just exposed the media's hypocrisy on live TV. They never saw it coming. The tension in the press room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Reporters shifted in their seats, gripping their pens a little tighter, glancing at one another as if searching for an escape route. The air crackled with anticipation, but also something else, discomfort. They had walked in thinking they were in control, that this would be just another routine press briefing where they could set the narrative. But Karoline Leavitt had other plans. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His tone was carefully measured, but his question carried an edge. Ilhan Omar's words, "Are you really suggesting she meant them as a literal call for violence?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, almost amused. A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "James, am I supposed to believe she meant it as a poetry reading?" A few low chuckles rippled through the room, but James pressed on, trying to regain control. "But rhetoric is open to interpretation," he argued. "You're treating her words as dangerous. What about Trump's past statements? Don't you think some of those could also be seen as incendiary?" Karoline gave a slow nod, as if James had just walked right into the trap she had set for him. "Oh, I see what you're doing," she said, feigning realization. "So now, intent matters? That's interesting." She let the weight of those words hang in the air before continuing. Because when Trump said, "Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard," the media spent years twisting it into a call for violence. But when Ilhan Omar literally says, "We need to fight in the streets," suddenly we need context. Silence. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably. James stiffened slightly, clearly not liking where this was going. Karoline kept her tone even, controlled, but sharp. "This isn't about fiery rhetoric, James. It's about who is allowed to use it." A few reporters exchanged glances. Some frantically typed notes, while others sat frozen, waiting for someone to fire back. Peter from CNN seized the opportunity. His voice was firm, but there was an urgency behind it, a need to regain control. "Karoline, you say there's a double standard, but let's be honest, Trump's rhetoric has led to real-world violence. Can you honestly compare that to Ilhan Omar's words?" Karoline let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Oh, Peter, people never disappoint." She reached for her iPad, fingers swiping across the screen before turning it toward the cameras. "This is Bernard Felix," she said, her voice crisp. "Just arrested for attacking a Republican volunteer. Shouted that they deserve to die." She swiped again. "This man? Firebombed a GOP office. Told police he was following orders." Another swipe. This time, she paused, letting the silence build before delivering the final blow. "And this?" She tapped the screen. "This is the man who shot a Republican congressman on a baseball field." The room was silent. Not a single reporter spoke. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Karoline calmly set the iPad down, folding her arms as she let her words sink in. "So tell me, Peter," she said, her voice smooth but cutting, "do these count as real-world consequences? Or does political violence only matter when it fits your narrative?" The shift in the room was undeniable. Tension thickened. A few reporters whispered to one another, scrambling for a response. From the back, a younger MSNBC journalist forced out a question, his voice cautious. "But Karoline, you're cherry-picking cases to make a broader claim. Isn't it dangerous to suggest that one side is responsible for all political violence?" Karoline turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ah, so now we care about nuance." The reporter stiffened. Karoline continued, her tone unwavering. "I find it funny how Trump supporters get blamed for everything, from election protests to a news hoax in NASCAR. But when a Democrat literally says, 'We need to fight in the streets,' suddenly we need to look at the bigger picture?" She let the question linger. Nobody answered. She exhaled slightly, checking her watch. "We're barely 20 minutes in, and you've already proven my point." She tapped the podium once, then looked back up. "The truth is, this was never about stopping dangerous rhetoric. It was always about controlling who was allowed to speak." Still no response. The press corps had been prepared for a fight, but not like this. Karoline straightened her posture, eyes sharp. "Next question." The tension in the room was suffocating. Reporters shuffled their notes, recalibrating their approach. The narrative wasn't going the way they had planned, and they knew it. Then, James from the Washington Post leaned forward again, pen tapping against his notepad. "Karoline, let's talk about Elon Musk. The president's decision to appoint him as head of the Department of Government Efficiency. Doesn't that seem like a way to reward a billionaire ally?" A few reporters nodded. They sensed a possible weak point. Karoline almost laughed. "Oh, so now you all care about billionaires influencing government." She folded her arms. "That's funny, because I don't remember any of you complaining when Mark Zuckerberg spent $400 million to help with elections." Silence. She pressed on. "Or when Jeff Bezos received billions in government contracts while owning a newspaper that conveniently never criticizes the left." Peter from CNN interjected quickly, trying to regain ground. "But Karoline, Musk isn't just any billionaire. He's been openly aligned with Trump's policies. Isn't this appointment just political favoritism?" Karoline didn't even blink. "Oh, you mean the same way Hunter Biden received cushy foreign business deals while his father was vice president? Or the way Nancy Pelosi's husband magically made all the right stock trades before major legislative decisions?" The room stiffened. Funny how political favoritism only seems to be an issue when it involves someone the media doesn't like. James adjusted his tie, pushing forward. "But Karoline, let's talk about oversight. Elon Musk now has access to government systems, specifically in the Treasury and DOJ. Shouldn't the American people be concerned about a private businessman having influence over public finances?" Karoline leaned in slightly, her voice firm. "Let's get our facts straight, James. The DOJ engineers Musk is working with only have read-only access to Treasury systems. They cannot write new code." A few reporters exchanged glances. They knew she was right. She continued. "And let's be honest, the real issue here isn't Musk having oversight. It's that he's actually going to expose how much taxpayer money has been wasted." The room fell silent. Then, from the back, a young journalist from NBC raised her voice. "But Karoline, Musk's companies, including SpaceX and Tesla, have received billions in government subsidies. Doesn't that create a conflict of interest? Karoline tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. That's interesting, she said smoothly. Because the Biden administration literally appointed former Google and Facebook executives to government roles overseeing tech regulations. A few cameras zoomed in. The game wasn't over. But one thing was clear, the media had come expecting to control the narrative. And Karoline Leavitt? She had just rewritten it. Karoline Leavitt destroys the media's narrative. They never saw it coming. Karoline scanned the press room, taking in the growing unease. The energy had shifted. They weren't getting the attack angles they wanted, and she could sense their frustration. So, she decided to drive it home. This administration was elected to drain the swamp, she said, her voice firm. To cut waste. To make government run like a business, not a slush fund for career politicians. She let the words settle. And I get it, the media doesn't like that. Because if the government actually became efficient, what would the Democratic Party campaign on? A few reporters chuckled under their breath. Others glared. Karoline checked the time, knowing they weren't done yet. All right, she said, with a knowing smile. Next question. The immigration trap, and why it failed. The press had failed to corner her on Elon Musk, but they had another attack lined up. Peter from CNN jumped in. Karoline, NBC reports that some illegal immigrants arrested under Trump's policies aren't being deported. Instead, they're being released with ankle monitors or phone check-ins. Isn't that a failure? Karoline barely held back a smirk. She had seen this one coming. I'm glad you asked, Peter, she said, turning slightly to the cameras. Let's talk numbers. She let the anticipation build for a second. As of this morning, over 8,000 illegal immigrants have been arrested under President Trump's policies. She paused. And out of those, only 461 have been released. That's less than 6%. Silence. But the media spins it as if mass releases are happening. James from the Washington Post pushed back. But Karoline, doesn't this prove Trump's policies aren't working? Why is anyone being released at all? Karoline didn't blink. Some were released due to medical conditions. Others because detention space is limited. She tilted her head slightly. And remind me, James, who's blocking funding for more detention centers? She let the question hang. The reporters knew exactly who was responsible. A younger MSNBC journalist jumped in, scrambling for a different approach. But Karoline, many of these individuals haven't committed crimes. Are you treating all undocumented immigrants as criminals? Karoline let out a light laugh. Oh, so now you care about the difference? She scanned the room, catching a few uneasy expressions. I remember when you all called Trump racist for deporting gang members. A few reporters shifted in their seats. But let's be clear, she continued, her voice firm. Entering this country illegally is already breaking the law. Peter from CNN wasn't done yet. Are you saying the administration has no responsibility for these releases? Karoline locked eyes with him. We are deporting as many as possible, she said evenly. But when Congress blocks resources, they can't turn around and blame us. Silence. She checked the time again. Well, she said lightly, but with unmistakable finality. Next question. The media had failed to pin her on immigration. But they weren't done yet. Gaza, and the question the media won't ask. James from the Washington Post leaned in, flipping through his notes. Karoline, the president has made it clear that Palestinians have no choice but to leave Gaza. But they say this is their home. How does the administration justify this? Karoline remained composed, her gaze scanning the room. The president's goal is simple, she said. Rebuild Gaza. Ensure peace. Prevent another war. She let that sit for a second. Then she continued. But let's be honest. Her tone sharpened slightly. The media keeps asking what Trump is doing, but never asks why Gaza is in ruins in the first place. A few reporters stiffened. Why is Gaza unlivable today? She asked, letting the silence stretch. Because Hamas, a terrorist group backed by Iran, launched a brutal attack on Israel. They slaughtered civilians, took hostages, used Palestinians as human shields. Peter from CNN jumped in. But Karoline, Are you saying Trump bears no responsibility for this crisis? Karoline let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. I'm saying Hamas started this war, she stated simply. But instead of demanding Hamas surrenders, the media is demanding Trump explain his response. She let that sink in. A young MSNBC reporter pushed forward. But Karoline, Palestinians say they don't want to leave Gaza. Is the U.S. prepared to force them out? Karoline met her gaze, without hesitation. No, she said firmly. The U.S. is not forcing anyone out. We are prepared to help rebuild, but we will not allow another Hamas-controlled war zone to emerge. James from the Washington Post pounced. The president said he's willing to use the military if necessary. Does that mean U.S. troops will be deployed? Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. The president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground, she clarified. But he's keeping all options open because when it comes to national security, he won't play political games. Some reporters looked dissatisfied. They wanted a reckless statement. She wasn't giving them one. She let a moment pass. The real question is, she scanned the room, making direct eye contact with James. Why aren't you asking Hamas to surrender? Silence. A flicker of discomfort crossed James's face. Another journalist from NPR tried to redirect. But Karoline, there are concerns that Trump's stance on Gaza will escalate tensions with key allies. What is the administration doing to prevent further instability? Karoline exhaled slightly, as if she had been waiting for this question all along. The president has already spoken with Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, she revealed. We're coordinating with our allies to ensure that the region stabilizes. She folded her hands on the podium. But the media keeps pretending that Trump is making rash, unilateral decisions. A few reporters looked down at their notes. Others typed away, already spinning their stories. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile. Next question. The media's last resort, misrepresentation. They had failed to trap her on Gaza. If they couldn't win with facts, they'd try something else, misrepresentation. Peter from CNN adjusted his mic, ready to strike. Karoline, CNN is reporting that you suggested illegal immigrants aren't deserving of humane treatment. Do you stand by that? Karoline's brow lifted slightly. She knew exactly where this was going. Peter, she said calmly, would you mind reading exactly what I said? Peter hesitated. He glanced at his notes, then back at her. Well, in context. No. Karoline cut him off smoothly. I asked for exactly what I said. Not your interpretation. Silence. Peter cleared his throat. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, he admitted. Karoline smirked. Of course you don't. She tapped on her iPad, pulling up the transcript herself. Allow me to help. She turned the screen toward the cameras and read aloud. I said, illegal immigration is a national security crisis, and the Biden administration's policies have made it worse. She looked up. Now, Peter, where exactly did I say anything about immigrants not deserving humane treatment? Peter's jaw tightened. Well, the implication was. Karoline held up a hand. Karoline Leavitt exposes the media's lies, live on air. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press room. Peter from CNN had just attempted to twist her words, but Karoline wasn't having it. No, Peter, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. CNN didn't report what I said. You twisted it. She let that sink in. The room tensed. Some journalists shifted in their seats. And this, she continued, her tone deliberate, is exactly what the media does. You don't like what I actually said, so you invent a version that fits your narrative. James from the Washington Post jumped in, hoping to regain control. Karoline, even if the wording was misinterpreted, don't you think? Karoline cut him off, flipping to a new tab on her iPad. Let's talk about misinterpretation, James. She tapped on an MSNBC headline and turned the screen toward the cameras. The bold text read, Karoline Leavitt refuses to deny Trump will use U.S. troops to remove Palestinians. She scanned the room. Raise your hand if you were here when I answered that question. A few journalists hesitated, then slowly raised their hands. Karoline leaned forward. Did I say that Trump would use the military to remove Palestinians? Silence. Anyone, she pressed. More silence. She tilted her head slightly. Because what I actually said was, and I quote, "The president has not committed to U.S. boots on the ground but is keeping all options open to maintain stability." She let the words settle before continuing. But MSNBC decided to rewrite reality. And now, Twitter is flooded with people believing a completely false headline. A young MSNBC reporter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Karoline, that headline is just an interpretation of." Karoline laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Interpretation," she repeated.
No.
"That's called a lie." She scanned the room, her expression sharp.
"This is how it works," she said.
"The media creates a false story, spreads it across every platform, and hopes people never fact-check it." She glanced at the cameras. "And if you don't believe me, just wait until tonight's news coverage." A few journalists looked uncomfortable. Others were already rewriting their narratives. Karoline checked the time. "Well," she said, with a knowing smile. "Next question." The media's pivot: blame Trump. The press had been caught red-handed twisting her words. But they weren't giving up. If they couldn't trap Karoline, they'd pivot to Trump. James from the Washington Post leaned forward, his voice careful but pointed. "Karoline, you've spent a lot of time criticizing the media's handling of rhetoric," he began. "But let's talk about the president's own words." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Here it came." James continued, flipping through his notes. "The president has a history of strong language, some would say inflammatory language. He's called political opponents enemies. He said we need to fight back hard. Given today's climate, don't you think his rhetoric contributes to division?" Karoline let out a slow breath, then met his gaze. "You mean the same way Ilhan Omar told her supporters to fight in the streets?" James hesitated. "Or the way Chuck Schumer threatened Supreme Court justices, saying they would pay the price?" James opened his mouth, then closed it. Karoline folded her hands. "This is what the press does," she said. "When Democrats use aggressive rhetoric, you call it passionate advocacy. But when Trump says something strong, you call it incitement." Silence. Peter from CNN jumped in, desperate to regain control. "But Karoline, the difference is that Trump is the former president and the current leader of the GOP. His words carry weight. Don't you think he has a responsibility to be more careful?" Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "Did you ask Joe Biden that?" Peter blinked. "When Biden called Trump supporters semi-fascists, where was your concern about division?" Peter stayed silent. "When Hillary Clinton said Republicans were part of a basket of deplorables, did you ask if she was responsible for political violence?" Peter stiffened. But Karoline wasn't done. Because when a far-left activist shot up a Republican baseball practice, nobody blamed Democratic rhetoric. The room was dead silent. When a man attacked Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's home, nobody asked if Chuck Schumer's words contributed to that. She let the words hang for a second. But when Trump says fight back, suddenly the media acts like he's calling for civil war. The press room was frozen. A younger journalist from MSNBC spoke up hesitantly. "But Karoline, Trump has been accused of encouraging January 6th. Shouldn't he acknowledge the impact his words had?" Karoline laughed lightly, shaking her head. "Oh, I love this game." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the reporters. "When Trump told supporters to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, you twisted it into a call for violence." She arched an eyebrow. "But when Biden said in Philadelphia that Trump supporters were a threat to democracy while standing in front of a blood-red backdrop, you didn't call it dangerous. You applauded it." A few journalists looked away. Others typed furiously, already drafting their spin. Karoline scanned the room, eyes sharp. "You don't actually care about rhetoric," she said. "You care about who's saying it." Peter shifted in his seat. "But Karoline, if Trump runs again, shouldn't he be more careful with his words?" Karoline exhaled slowly. "The media has spent years demanding that Trump change his tone." She paused for emphasis. "But has the media ever changed its tone about Trump?" Silence. "Did you ever stop calling him a threat to democracy?" Silence. Did you stop comparing him to a dictator? Silence. Did you ever acknowledge that his supporters are millions of everyday Americans, not some extremist fringe? She scanned the room. Of course not. She let out a soft chuckle. Because the media's job isn't to demand civility, it's to demand submission. No one spoke. Karoline checked the time, then looked back up. Well, she said, with a knowing smirk. Next question. Fire Karoline Leavitt exposes Ilhan Omar and the media's hypocrisy, live on air. The press room had been buzzing all morning. But suddenly, a ripple of murmurs spread through the reporters, their eyes darting to their phones. Something was happening. Karoline noticed immediately. What is it? She asked, arms crossed. A journalist from MSNBC cleared his throat. Well, Karoline, he said carefully. Ilhan Omar is live on Morning Joe right now, and she's talking about you. A murmur ran through the room. The cameras zoomed in. Karoline smirked. Oh, she said, tapping her earpiece. Well, let's hear it then. A producer rushed forward, holding up an iPad with the live MSNBC broadcast. On screen, Ilhan Omar sat across from Joe Scarborough, her expression tight with frustration. This administration is dangerous, Omar declared. Karoline Leavitt is spreading lies to cover up for Trump's failures. And let's be clear, she is deliberately putting people's lives at risk. Karoline raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Omar continued, her voice rising. The way she dismissed concerns over Trump's rhetoric, it's reckless. It's a direct threat to democracy. And let's not forget, she's using the same dog whistles that the far right has used for decades. The MSNBC host nodded in agreement. Then he added. Karoline even questioned her comments about fighting in the streets. Do you want to clarify what you meant? Omar didn't hesitate. Yes, she said firmly. I was speaking metaphorically. I was calling for people to stand up against this administration's attacks on our rights. But Karoline is twisting my words because she's desperate to distract from what's really happening. The clip ended. The press room sat in silence, waiting for Karoline's response.
She took her time,
letting the weight of it settle. Then, finally, she shook her head, her voice smooth, controlled. That's cute. A few reporters shifted in their seats. But here's the problem. She gestured toward them. You all just heard what Ilhan Omar said, live on air. That she was speaking metaphorically. That she wasn't actually calling for violence. A pause. Now, let's rewind. She tapped her iPad, pulling up Omar's actual quote from a previous speech. She read it aloud. We might actually see somebody get killed. We have to fight this in the streets. She looked back at the room. Tell me, she said, voice sharp. What part of that sounds metaphorical? Silence. She let the quiet stretch, then continued. This is what they do, she said. They say something extreme. Then, when they get called out, they claim they were misinterpreted. She tapped her mic lightly, her voice dripping with amusement. So, let's get this straight. She arched an eyebrow. When Ilhan Omar says fight in the streets, we're supposed to assume she means protest. She tilted her head slightly. But when Trump says fight like hell, we're supposed to assume he means a coup? A few reporters exchanged uneasy glances. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. It's not about what's being said, she said. It's about who's saying it. She let that sink in. Another reporter, trying to salvage the moment, spoke up. But Karoline, aren't you just doing the same thing? Taking Ilhan Omar's words out of context. Karoline sighed dramatically, shaking her head. See, that's the difference. She spread her hands. I didn't invent what she said. I didn't twist her words. I played the clip exactly as it happened. She tapped her iPad again, flipping it toward the cameras. I'm not the one spinning a narrative, she said. She is. Silence. The press had nothing to say. Karoline checked the time. Well, she said with a knowing smile. Next question. Fire the media's new strategy. Pivot and distract. The press had tried everything. Twisting Karoline's words. Blaming Trump. Letting Ilhan Omar attack her live on air. But none of it had worked. Omar had walked straight into Karoline's trap. And now, the media needed a way out. James from the Washington Post was the first to attempt an escape. "Karoline, let's move on," he said, flipping his notepad. "The president recently made some strong remarks about the economy. Can you clarify?" Karoline held up a hand, stopping him cold. "Oh, no." She shook her head. "We're not moving on just yet." James hesitated. The tension snapped back into the room. Karoline continued. "You all just spent the last 20 minutes framing me as the problem." Her eyes scanned the press corps. "Let's not suddenly pretend like this Ilhan Omar situation never happened." Silence. Karoline glanced at the cameras. "America deserves to see this," she said. "This is how the media works." A few journalists shifted uncomfortably. Peter from CNN jumped in, his voice tight. "But Karoline, we've already addressed Omar's comments. We've given you a chance to respond." "No, Peter." She cut him off. "You gave Ilhan Omar a chance to rewrite her own words." She folded her arms. "I'm just wondering, when is the media finally going to hold her accountable? The way you hold Trump accountable?" Peter's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting we haven't covered Omar fairly?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Well, let's test that." She pulled up a set of headlines on her iPad and turned the screen toward the cameras. "Here's how you covered Trump." She read them aloud. Loudspeaker: "Trump's violent rhetoric inspires insurrection." CNN. Loudspeaker: "Trump's words are a threat to democracy." The Washington Post. Loudspeaker: "Trump's dangerous speech sparks extremism." MSNBC. She swiped again, revealing a new set of headlines. "And here's how you covered Omar." Loudspeaker: "Ilhan Omar calls for action on civil rights."
CNN.
Loudspeaker: "Omar's passionate speech highlights political divide." NBC. Loudspeaker: "Ilhan Omar urges Americans to fight for justice." MSNBC. She looked up. "Spot the difference." Silence. The reporters knew they had no answer. Karoline tapped the iPad lightly, her voice calm but cutting. "This is the double standard Americans are tired of." She let the words sink in. James tried again, desperate to change the subject. "Well, Karoline, as I was saying, the president's economic policies." Karoline shook her head. "Oh, so now we want to talk about the economy?" A few reporters glanced at their phones, seeing the backlash unfold in real time. Karoline sighed, looking directly at the press corps. "You can try to change the subject all you want," she said. "But Americans see what's happening here." She set her iPad down, arms crossed. "This isn't about truth. It's about who gets protected and who gets destroyed." Silence. Karoline checked the time. "Well," she said with a small smirk. "Next question."